Hi, this is Paul. Yes, a couple of days ago on Twitter, yesterday, I don't remember when it was, up came a story from the Religion News Service. Nadia Bolz-Weber installed as ELCA's, that's Evangelical Lutheran Church of America's, first pastor of public witness. And I saw her, and because I've been doing all the Mark Driscoll stuff, I thought, oh, that's interesting. I often compare Mark Driscoll and Rob Bell, and that's a valid comparison. But in some ways, this is even a better comparison of like opposites. Now, they elevated her, denomination elevated her in some ways to the evangelistic face. Now, they won't call that, they'll call it public witness. Now, again, I've been reading Molly Worthen's Apostles of Reason, and these tensions go back a long ways in the development of American Christianity, evangelical versus mainline. Now, when I mentioned the relationship that I see between Nadia Bolz-Weber and Mark Driscoll, some people on Twitter immediately reacted. No, because Mark Driscoll bad, Nadia Bolz-Weber good. Other people will be like, her, and off you go. But she's one of the few mainline celebrities, and there's some reasons for that we're going to get into in the process of this video. You know, kind of the founder of, in a way, Robert Schuller sort of bridged the mainline evangelical divide quite well. Robert Schuller in Southern California started with a drive-through church, eventually had the Crystal Cathedral. The Crystal Cathedral now has been sold to the Roman Catholic Church. But he sort of is the fountainhead of celebrity, well, not really, at least in the contemporary frame. Because if you go back, you've got Dwight L. Moody, and in fact, many will argue that church fathers were, in a sense, celebrity pastors of their day. I'm not going to get into that into this video, but that's something that we'll have to talk about as we continue to dive deeper into the rise and fall of Mars Hill. So some of you don't know who this woman is, and so I think it's worthwhile taking a look at some of the news articles and getting some orientation so that we can begin to see the relationship between her and the history that has basically gone through the American church in the last 20 plus years. Now, the rise and fall of Mars Hill, in the second episode, they get into some of the history, and because I like history, I like that episode quite well. You can't understand any of this if you don't understand the emergent movement. Now, I just saw that Jordan, it's not Jordan B. Peterson. It's the Lutheran guy. Did some commentary on rise and fall of Mars Hill. I should just find it. That's right. It's Jordan B. Cooper, and a discussion about Mars Hill, megachurch celebrity culture. And I watched about a quarter of it, which is being a bad YouTube consumer, because we all know that, well, at least I know, because you look at YouTube analytics, how fast people fall off a video. But, you know, I liked some of his commentary, and his commentary in this case is really rather interesting because Nadia Bolz-Weber is, of course, a Lutheran, and that's not incidental either in her formulation of understanding theology and how she works it. Now, Religion News Service is sort of an interesting organization. I could say a lot about that. But all of this stuff is sort of tied up in the emergent movement, which then splits into the progressive evangelicals and the young, restless, and reformed. And so in that sense, Mark Driscoll typifies this, but so does Rob Bell, and so does Nadia Bolz-Weber. And again, we're going to get into this in this video. Nadia Bolz-Weber installed as ELCA's first pastor of public witness. We acknowledge that Nadia has a ministry that goes far beyond the walls of any one church, the installing bishop told Religious News Service. Reverend Nadia Bolz-Weber left is installed as a pastor of public as pastor of public witness by Bishop Jim Gonia. Now, pay attention to titles. A lot of the focus on the rise and fall of Mars Hill is going to be on ecclesiology and polity, which means structure. And evangelicalism is famously egalitarian and flat structure. Now, maybe not necessarily egalitarian in terms of questions of women in office, but they don't have bishops. Everybody's sort of a law unto themselves. And so you'll hear people who are part of denominations and have a little bit more robust structure usually sort of chipping away at that. But there's a lot of room in denominations. Some denominations are very hierarchical. You really have to submit to the bishop. Other denominations have bishops, but not so much. The Christian Reformed Church doesn't have bishops. We're much more conciliar, which means we have groups of people at the head. So at the head of this church is a church council. And so when you get into Mars Hill, you have questions of a board of elders. It was interesting. I thought Jordan B. Cooper's presentation on some of the development of this was quite good. But she, of course, has a bishop of the Rocky Mountain Synod of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. Now, that title evangelical is a little bit deceptive because, again, as I spoke about in one of the previous videos, that word means different things in England than it does in the United States, which is why the founders of Christianity today call themselves neo-evangelical, because in Europe, evangelical basically means Protestant, because that was the label that was used in the Protestant Reformation to distinguish themselves from the Church of Rome. In a service at Montview Boulevard Presbyterian Church in Denver, well, that's interesting. Why was the service in a Presbyterian church? Well, this gets into the whole... The thing to remember in American church is, in American ecclesiology, in the church world in America, is that the reverberations of the modernist fundamentalist split continue to move forward. And so you will find Methodists, Lutherans, Presbyterians very much on the same page opposing neo-evangelicals, fundamentalists, Pentecostals. That's really where the line goes. Nadia Bolz-Weber was installed this weekend as the first pastor of Public Witness for the largest Lutheran denomination in the United States. Bolz-Weber, who has often attracted controversy, is perhaps best known for her New York Times best-selling books, including Shameless, A Sexual Reformation, and Pastrix, The Cranky Beautiful Faith of Sinner and Saint, the prayer and profanity-filled memoir of her journey from alcoholic stand-up comic to Lutheran pastor. Now, none of this is incidental to my entire argument. She was called to the role of pastor of Public Witness by the Rocky Mountain Synod, blah, 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 blah. She was supported, she said, has supported her ministry since she first applied to seminary. Pastor of Public Witness Pastor of Public Witness may be a new position for the ELCA, but other denominations have clergy in similar public-facing roles. One might argue that Bishop Barron is in some ways analogous in terms of his role as a bishop, and it's unusual for him to be a bishop in this way. Again, there's a lot of interesting overlaps here because she's part of a magisterial, hierarchical to some degree denomination. She has a bishop, all right? For example, the PCUSA ordained Fred Rogers of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood as an evangelist for television. Now, Nadia Bolz-Weber is no Mr. Rogers, but this is where a lot of this weirdness sort of comes together. Bolz-Weber laughed at the comparison to the beloved children's TV host, calling it counterintuitive. That's right, but the connections are very much there. But she said it works. She'd seen Won't You Be My Neighbor, the popular 2018 documentary about Rogers and his show, the day after she left the church she founded, the House of All Saints and Sinners in Denver, to pursue her current work as public theologian. There's another interesting name. And a while ago, I did some videos on platform and church. And what I said there very much connects in with this. Because, let's say the Southern Baptist Convention is all in a bundle over women in church office. But Beth Moore and many female bloggers have platforms that give them far more power and far more influence than your pastor of a local congregation. And her move from local pastor to public theologian, or their title, what was it again? Pastor of public witness, has everything to do with that. And of course, that gets very much into the Mark Driscoll story, the celebrity church, why Robert Schuller retires and Crystal Cathedral can no longer pay the bills. Mark Driscoll leaves. My next video, I was intended to dive into what killed Mars Hill, but then this came up and I thought this is a nice background for that question. Mark Driscoll, they sort of, okay, now we're going to address you and we're going to talk about accountability, and that's going to come up here. And basically he resigns, flies the coop, goes down to Arizona. You know, he and his wife have an epiphany. God spoke to them separately, and there's a trap that's being laid, and our term call here is done. So he goes down to Arizona, Scottsdale, Arizona, and sort of starts up the same thing. And we'll talk about that a little bit later too. So it's interesting. So then if you go from this article to the other article, why she left the church that she founded, which was also on the same service, headed for a larger stage, Nadia Bolz-Weber leaves her house in order. And again, now she, in some ways, does better than Mark Driscoll because he basically gets kicked out and exploded. She leaves on her own terms. It's a very interesting article. Again, I'll leave all the notes. Congregants pray over Reverend Nadia Bolz-Weber during her farewell services at House of All Saints, Sinners and Saints in Denver, June 8, 2018. So this is, we've had COVID in the middle, but this is sort of 3 years in the making. With silvering hair, dark makeup, liturgically inspired tattoos, Nadia Bolz-Weber stood late on the Sunday afternoon in early July to celebrate her final service as pastor of House of All Sinners and Saints, the Denver church she founded a decade ago as a 39-year-old divinity student. The service was like any other, at half-ass. That's clever. I mean, I don't know. It's fun. Children played freely in the aisles. The Capella Choir finished its opening hymn, and Bolz-Weber invoked God using both feminine and masculine imagery. Only the regular members might have noticed the presence of many first-time packing the church, taking a final opportunity to hear its celebrity pastor preach. Okay, now she's a celebrity pastor. She doesn't have a mega church. I tried to get a sense of how big this church is, and churches don't necessarily publicize these things unless the numbers are really big. And so I just went to Google Maps and looked at the street view, and yeah, it's not a mega church. Maybe, I have no idea. And if someone out there knows, leave a comment. In mid-June, again, 2018, Bolz-Weber, a Lutheran, and now one of the best-known mainline Protestant preachers in the country. Now, this is important, too, because you'll find, she's been on, I think it was Fresh Air. She's been on major podcasts. Washington Post covers her. New York Times Post covers her. This is the kind of promotion that many evangelical celebrity pastors would dream of when it's just not negative press like someone like Mark Driscoll would get. And so a lot of this, again, we're in an attention economy, and a lot of this is about attention. How does she get attention, and how can you be a celebrity pastor in the mainline? There aren't a lot of them. Bolz-Weber said she had decided to step away only recently and still can't explain entirely what made her feel like it was the first time. She reached a point, she said, where the church still loves me, but I don't think the church still needs me. Now, there's another video I found that was super interesting. Nobody sent me this video. The YouTube algorithm served it up, which is a little bit frightening. But Francis Chan interviewed by Mark Driscoll and Joshua Harris. Now, the latest of the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill was a really good episode on Josh Harris, and I know Esther dove into that in a blog, and I'll probably get there if I don't lose interest. But Francis Chan is an interesting guy. I mean, many look at Francis Chan among this sort of post-emergent, post-Young, Restless, and Reformed as the genuine article. He's a guy who plants a megachurch. He leaves it, plants another church. He leaves that, goes, tries to get back into Hong Kong. He's got a very interesting story. Of course, he's very close with Preston Sprinkle, who's been on the channel. Very interesting guy, and is sort of a real foil for these other two guys because, of course, Josh Harris deconstructs. Mark Driscoll goes down the rabbit hole. He still goes down the hole. He's still in. Francis Chan seems to be a guy of a lot of integrity, but Francis Chan, of course, turns his back on hell, sort of like Rob Bell, sort of like Bolz Weber. But, okay, so this is where you see the emergent, the Young, Restless, and Reformed, and progressive evangelicals. You have to see all of these people in part of this same movement that's developing. I've, only listened to half of it. Very interesting conversation. Francis Chan talked about exactly what Nadia Bolz-Weber talks about here in terms of leaving the church while they still love her for the church to grow. Now, I think about that, and sometimes I think maybe I should have left the church years ago because this church obviously hasn't necessarily thrived numerically in the last 10 years. So she decides to leave. I was aware how dangerous it was for founders to stay too long. It's very true. And again, I actually applaud her for the decision to leave. And she left in charge. It's very interesting. Okay, in 2011, after preaching at an annual Easter sunrise service at Red Rocks, the Denver Post put Bolz-Weber on its front page. Bolz-Weber was horrified. She said to Terry Gross on Fresh Air, when suburbanites suddenly showed up at Half-Ass, today, the congregation, roughly 500 housemates. Okay, so they're not a mega church, about 500, so below 200 is a small church. Between 200 and 1,000 is a medium church. Between 1,000 and up is a mega church. We might even say that's sort of the nomenclature that pastors use for categorizing these things. So not a mega church. By 2015, Bolz-Weber had put 2 books, Pastrix and Accidental Saints, on the New York Times bestsellers list. Now, again, very popular. You won't find Mark Driscoll's books on the New York Times bestsellers list. Now, as we saw with the Jordan Peterson story, the New York Times is selective about the kinds of things it's going to put on its bestsellers list. And for reasons, again, we're going to get into, Nadia Bolz-Weber is exactly the kind of person they want on the list. Because of how she fits into the cultural imaginary of maybe what faith can be with a worldview that secular, urban, progressives, New York Times readers can find appealing. She lectures constantly, most recently at the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America youth gathering, at theologians at Pepperdine University, and at the Feminist Makers Conference in San Francisco. Her admirers range from conservative columnist Rod Dreher. Rod, are you a fan? I've read what you've written about her. Interesting. To Black Lives Matter's activist Shaun King. She's also giving up handling of the day-to-day business of the church, making her official break all but a formality. Bolz-Weber is hardly the only celebrity pastor to walk away from local church ministry. Recently, evangelical pastor Francis Eugene Cho announced he was leaving the Seattle church he founded in 2001 to devote himself to anti-poverty work. 4 years ago, Rob Bell left his megachurch, Mars Hill, after 12 years to focus on speaking and writing. Unlike these pastors, Bolz-Weber is leaving in part to increase her contact with secular audiences. And again, this makes perfect sense. As she calls it, preaching to the Gentiles. Are they really Gentiles for what she's doing? This is kind of like in June, someone being bold to declare, surrounded by rainbow flags, that they're affirming of same-sex marriage. It doesn't take a lot of courage in America. I don't know if it's really Gentiles you're preaching to. There's a hunger for the basic message of the gospel. Now remember, she's a Lutheran, and that's critical here. And so Jordan B. Cooper, I'd really love to see a video where he talks about her. I'd really love to see a conversation between her and Jordan B. Cooper. That would be very interesting. Most people aren't going to show up in church on Sunday morning, right? But it doesn't mean that the message of the gospel can't still be freeing to them. Well, what is this message? And I would say probably the word she would focus on most would be liberation. And we're going to talk about that as we go. In Denver, many are asking what will become of the House of All Saints after its founding pastor departs. Reverend Reagan Humber left, speaks during a farewell service. Since Bolz-Weber hired Reagan Humber, well, that's interesting. See, again, you have churches that tend to be, churches with bishops tend to be run by individuals, okay? It's very hierarchical. Churches with councils tend to be run by groups. Now, many churches try to have a combination of these, including the Roman Catholic Church. The Christian Reformed Church is quite conciliar in that you've got synod, classis, and local church council, or many in the CRC would flip it around. You've got local church council, classis, and synod. But there are lines of accountability all up and down. Now, the pastor being hired by another pastor, see, this is where celebrity megachurches get very interesting. And this is part of what's beneath the surface in the rise and fall of Mars Hill. Because Mark Driscoll's a dictator. From what I've been able to see, he's a bit of a tyrant. Yeah, he had a board of elders, but then he had this oversight team of people who weren't local. And so you'll hear those conversations just kind of popping up and down throughout the rise and fall of Mars Hill. And for church insiders, you listen to that and say, yeah, this is the two poles of, in some ways, apostolic succession versus kind of a paper pope with councils, okay? And this tension has been within the church. I'm preaching actually on Acts 15 this week. This tension has been within the church all along. You have the council in Jerusalem where James, the brother of Jesus, stands up and gives a pronouncement. So there's a lot of tension in Christian ecclesiology between those two poles. But the fact that she hired her successor is an indication that it's sort of where they are ecclesiastically. 9 months before he became an Episcopal priest. I thought they were Lutherans. This is the main line. Keep that in mind. She told him to prepare for the day she would leave. She was probably looking for a successor. Admitted she was still shocked when the time came. Now, half-assed pastor Humber said in an email to RNS that he expected that Bolz-Weber's departure would benefit the community. Being a pastor isn't about me. It's not about Nadia. Being a pastor is about the whole community. Okay, so there you see the tension between apostolic succession and a conciliar sense of church. And again, this has been in the church right from the start, right from Acts 15. If you might say that Pentecost is the birthday of the church, Acts 15 is the birthday of church politics. Excuse me. It's about feeding the whole body. Now, this theme is part of the tension beneath the rise and fall of Mars Hill. And that's part of what Mike Cosper is really wrestling with, because celebrity pastors, one-person shows, now probably the church is down to 500. So these are his vestments. Humber, who will take over as pastor. There's a picture of him. Humber takes comfort in the idea that half-assed doesn't look at all perfect. Sure, we're going to screw things up, he said. But we'll screw things up and we'll still come back the next week, and that's where grace happens. That's when church gets real and the dead are raised. This is such interesting stuff because, of course, I mean, there's some of that in me, and you'll see that in my videos and to the degree that you see anything of what goes on at Living Stones. Very non-anxious, high in openness. That collaborative style has made half-ass a powerful model. said Bo Young Lee, Dean of Faculty at Iliff School of Theology, who once taught Humber at Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. Word on church history: if your seminary has the word union in it, it's part of mainline consolidation. Okay? There's Union Theological Seminary in New York. There's Theological Union in San Francisco. You're very much in mainline land here. Humber, who came to half-ass from St. Gregory Nyssa Episcopal Church in San Francisco, is well equipped to carry on the church's alternative vibe. His partner is a hairstylist who moonlights as a drag queen named Fruit Bomb. And Humber is open about his struggles with opiates and alcohol. People in recovery know what it's like to be at the end of your ability, and that's powerful, says Asher, a longtime half-ass member who was the first transgender member to be ordained in the ELCA. O'Callahan was drawn to Bolz-Weber, he said, because she leads from a place of vulnerability, a trait he feels Humber shares. As Bolz-Weber's final service wound down, parishioners came forward to receive blessings from her. At the end, the congregation returned the favor, performing a traditional laying on of hands. Then folding tables were brought out for a classic Lutheran potluck, mainly consisting in casseroles. A woman sang a song mocking the criticism Bolz-Weber occasionally receives for being too progressive and overly tattooed. The congregation's parting gift was a stole with the image of Wonder Woman on it. We're going to talk a little. I'm certainly going to mention Jonathan Pageau's, in my opinion, his best video on parasitic storytelling. None of this is incidental. Symbolism happens. The church has never been mine, she said. It's always belonged to God. Okay, it's always been God's. So there's a little introduction to Bolz-Weber. Now, I got to manage my OBS here. Okay. Now, where's the connection with Driscoll? Because reading this, you would imagine she would be just opposite of Driscoll. But they're like opposites. What does that mean? Blue Like Jazz, quite famously, and again, Blue Like Jazz is a foundational text in the emergent movement. It's hard for me to relate to many of you how important this book was at its time. It was all over the place. And this was sort of, and as, again, Jordan B. Cooper said, there was a certain discomfort that arose in the transactional nature of the seeker movement. Well, what's the seeker movement? Again, Robert Schuller, a lot of these things go back to Robert Schuller, and Robert Schuller is mentioned in The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. But the seeker movement comes out, Bill Hybels, Rick Warren, safe place to hear a dangerous message. They're going to use, and again, if you read Molly Worthen's Apostles of Reason, part of what made neo-evangelicals different from the fundamentalists was they embraced psychology and social science, and they used psychology and social science to really birth the church growth movement, Donald McGavran. And then from there, the seeker movement came out with a full-blown employing of the church growth principles. The emergent movement was a response against that. And in many ways, it was sort of going from the 80s to the 90s. You were going from button-down boomers employing all of their, the counterculture is already baked into this, employing all of their smarts in order to build prevailing corporations. Oh, I mean churches. And yes, I have detailed files on all these things. Those who grew up, Gen X comes around, and they're sort of like, nah. And I remember in one of my junkets to Willow Creek, they had the Gen X service. And what was the guy's name? Dieter. You'll put it in the comments. I want to say Dieter Bohn, but he's at The Verge. His is an interesting story too. I should look him up. But the Gen X service at Willow Creek never worked because Willow Creek said, well, Willow Creek is sort of peak modernism when it comes to evangelicalism. And Willow Creek said, we can apply our business principles to the Gen X. And just like major corporations were able to market to boomers and then to Gen Xers and then to millennials and then to Gen Zers, we too are going to use the same principles as major corporations in order to sell Jesus, basically using fundamentalism, Four Spiritual Laws, Roman Road. We're basically going to use this to sell Jesus to the masses. And in that way, the Seeker movement was deeply neo-evangelical and in many ways just the next iteration of it. And the emergent comes back as a big push against it. And that push is going to go two ways. It's going to go the direction of the young, restless, and reformed, and it's going to go the direction of what eventually will become progressive evangelicalism. And progressive evangelicalism just sort of drains into the main line, which sort of drains into the desert. And, well, not really the desert, just kind of the background noise. And we'll get into that, why the mainline evangelical just continues to become background noise in American culture. And this then, again, we'll go where we go. I know where the video's going, so I don't want to give too much away. Can't say everything at once. So anyway, Blue Like Jazz, Rise and Fall of Mars Hill mentions numerous times. You'll hear Donald Miller's name mentioned. And if you Google Donald Miller and check out his story, another very interesting story. He's one of the main sources of the emergent movement. And a lot of the grime lines, the crud that gives us a sense of authenticity. Because Gen X, now, of course, I was born in the early mid 60s, and so I'm right on the cusp of Boomer and Gen X, as is Jordan Peterson, as are the Weinstein brothers. So a bunch of us that are sort of born in the twilight of the baby boom, but not yet quite full-fledged Gen X, we kind of see both sides of this thing. We kind of seen the tailored corporate professionalism of the Seeker movement that was, in a way, a response to all of that, the demythologizing of both fundamentalism and the mainline. Now, so the re-authenticity, when you look at Bolz-Weber and when you look at Mark Driscoll, is all going to be about the grime. Remember, both of these are going to appeal to working class. In many ways, Bolz-Weber is an attempt of the mainline to recapture the working class. In that sense, but she's not going to do it like, let's say, Bill Clinton. Hillary is very much, Northern mainline. Bill Clinton was Southern Baptist. All right. So Bolz-Weber is sort of, now they're both Westerners, which is interesting. It's going to be working class, but can the mainline capture the working class? Mainline wants to speak truth to power. Mainline wants to be progressive. And so now you're going to get kind of the tensions, the social tensions you get in limousine liberals with respect to the mainline. Mainline, you have the Rockefeller Cathedral in New York City. Mainline, you have Marble Collegiate, the collegiate RCAs in New York City. Mainline, you have these downtown churches, but of course, in the 60s and then the 60s to the 70s, downtown becomes basically goes downhill, and then 80s to 2000s, you have the rise of Friends, Sex and the City, downtown becomes chic again. And so in many ways, Bolz-Weber takes all of this and sort of puts it all in her story. Former alcoholic, comedian, tattooed. Look at this picture from the Washington Post 2013. Bare arms with a clerical collar. Now, imagine me, Jacob wants me to wear a clerical collar, so I'll buy one from some of the places you can still buy them. I'll get a clerical collar and I'll cut the sleeves off and I'll get tatted up. And that will attract a certain amount of people, because what we're doing is we're taking, and again, Pageau is probably better equipped to talk about why it's basically this inversion that Pageau keeps talking about. And she cusses all the time. She cusses a lot more than Mark Driscoll. And she talks about sex. She wrote an entire book on sex. Compare her preaching about sex to Mark Driscoll's preaching about sex. This is written by Michelle Borstein. You can continue to follow a lot of her writing. Look at how it's titled, A Budding Star of Progressive Christianity. And the newspapers are always looking for these people, because it's, all of those mega church pastors, all of those celebrity pastors, they all vote for the wrong people. And so, look, we've got one, and it's a woman. Now, Nadia Bolz-Weber's tattooed Lutheran pastor represents a new muscular form of progressive Christianity. Again, this is basically a contemporary of Driscoll. Bolz-Weber's liberal, again, conservative, but again, it's just not liberal and conservative. You can do quadrants and you can map this out. These are both populists. These are both grime liners. These are both people who are going to speak to the underclass, but they're going to have very different messages for the underclass. Now, this gets into some of the ironies with the progressive relationship with the underclass, because as many people are noticed, progressives often preach libertinism and live Puritanism. So, would we like Barack and Michelle Obama if they had an open relationship? Liberal, foul-mouthed articulation of Christianity speaks to fed-up believers. You could just as easily say Driscoll's conservative, foul-mouthed articulation of Christianity speaks to fed-up believers. They're preaching to very similar audiences with two different messages. Austin. Nadia Bolz-Weber bounds into the University United Methodist Church, again, this is mainline, sanctuary like a superhero. From Planet Alternative Christian, her 6'1" frame is plastered with tattoos. Her arms are sculpted by competitive weightlifting. And to show it all off, this pastor is wearing a tight tank top and jeans. Looking out at the hundreds of people crowded into the pews to hear her present the gospel of Jesus Christ, she sees dockers and blazers, sensible shoes, grandmothers and soccer moms, nary a facial piercing. To Bolz-Weber's bafflement, this is now her new congregation, mainstream America. Shouldn't be a surprise. These people who put her memoir near the top of the New York Times bestsellers list this week came out in September. They're the ones who followed her every tweet and Facebook posting by the thousands, who made the Lutheran minister a budding star for the liberal Christian set. Okay, again, just like Driscoll, mass media. Very similar audiences. They're emerging out of the similar pot of what's sort of bubbling under America that a lot of the other religious offerings aren't satisfying. A quick tour through her 44 years doesn't seem likely to wind up here. It includes, oh really, it doesn't? See, part of the problem with a lot of religious reporters is they don't get around enough. This shouldn't be a huge surprise. It includes teen rebellion against her family's fundamentalist Christianity, a nosedive into drug and alcohol addiction, a lifestyle of sleeping around, and a stint doing stand-up in grungy Denver comedy clubs. If you get into the Josh Harris, the latest episode of Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, Cosper made a lot of really good points. And in some ways, when he looks at Josh Harris and says, it's sort of like Kim Kardashian. You have a talent, you know how to be noticed. You know how to use social media. You know how to speak. I mean, pastors, this is key skill for pastor. And if you listen to Driscoll, he does it too. Now, I'm going to talk about Driscoll more because I've started listening to some of his stuff online, and It's nothing new. When I listen to Driscoll, especially in his Reformed years, he's just cribbing Tim Keller and John Piper. That's pretty much, I mean, Mark Driscoll's no stranger to plagiarism. I'll say it. Which is where, strangely enough, the match with her fans makes sense. The type of social liberals who typically fill the pews of mainline churches. Mainline churches' pews aren't filled. See, this is in the imagination. All these huge, beautiful, old mainline churches, they're empty. And we're going to talk about why. Like outsiders among fellow liberals in their lives if they are truly believing Christians. If they are people who really experience Jesus and his resurrection. Experience Jesus' resurrection when, and this is sort of the mainline-ish mythology and symbolism of Jordan Peterson. Well, resurrection means, and of course this was the real shock that Rationality Rules got with Jonathan Pageau. If they are people who want to hear words from the apostles in church, not, I don't know who that is, or Barack Obama. In her body and her theology, Bolz-Weber represents a new muscular form of liberal Christianity. Again, Driscoll was a new muscular form of Reformed conservative Christianity in his heyday, one that merges the passion and life-changing fervor of evangelicalism with the commitment to inclusiveness and social justice of mainline Protestantism. I've been starting a little stream on Twitter, just plucking things out of news articles. Buzzwords are holy words, so remember that. Buzzwords are holy words. She's tatted up, foul-mouthed champion of people sick of being belittled as not Christian enough for the right or too Jesus-y for the left. Interesting. There's always a market. You show us all your dirty laundry, it's all out there, the Reverend John Elford of the University United Methodist Church booms, as if he is introducing a rock star, leading the cheering crowd into an impassioned round of hymn singing. Bolz-Weber springs on stage to do a reading from her book, but first she addresses the language that's about to be unleashed on the pulpit. I don't think church leaders should pretend that there's something they're not. The crowd erupts in applause. Bolz-Weber pulls out a new kitschy item that she raffles off to raise money for church charity. She waves a gift certificate for a free tattoo. Then she speaks to her new reality. You ladies over 70 dig deep because you know you want it. And so you can read the whole thing. Christianity, Bolz-Weber preaches, has nothing to do with rules. Now, this is 2013. 2021... Ever read Everyday Feminism? There's a lot of rules. Has nothing to do with rules. It's the process thing. It's the process of things constantly dying and then being made new. These things, she says, might be the alcoholic who emerges into sobriety, some false narrative we have about ourselves, religious institutions that no longer inspire. I think God is wanting to be known. And in my experience of God wanting to be known is much more a person who is much more in the person who is annoying me at the moment rather than the sunset. She says, she's presenting these God is presented in these challenging interactions. I never experienced God in camping or trees or nature. So we've got an urbanism going on here. I hate nature, she told the Austin crowd. God invented takeouts and duvets for a reason. So read the whole thing. Very interesting. Now, again, like Driscoll, she's sex positive. Now, if you want to read an interesting take on her book in Christianity Today, now, part of the reason I subscribe to Christianity Today, now, a lot of people interpreted what I said as very negative of Christianity Today. I've got a nuanced view of Christianity Today. I just thought it's ironic, but yet apropos of their deconstruction of Driscoll and some of the points that they'll make about how in many ways he begins in the emergent and he winds up just like the Seekers. And you're not really going to deconstruct celebrity pastoring as wholly a evangelical thing when you've got Oprah, Rob Bell, and Nadia Bolz-Weber. Because they are celebrity clergy, they just don't have churches. And the reason they don't have churches is it's tough to do this and church because of the political alignment. Now, so the book that she came out recently, Shameless, A Case for Not Feeling Bad About Feeling Good. And again, she gets a significant write-up in The New Yorker. Evangelical pastors would die for something like that. A lot of celebrity pastors, what they're good at is finding a way into the media. Look at Carl Lentz and kind of the flashy Hillsong people. But now there's a like opposite with Driscoll here because, and if you listen to the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill about women, there he goes into, Mars Hill and Mark Driscoll's outspoken use of sex. Wives should please their husbands. Husbands should please their wives. Now, again, this is evangelicalism, so it's all within marriage. Not so for Bolz-Weber. There, you're much more in the realm of authenticity. But now, again, which rules? Because Driscoll's going to have rules, and increasingly, the sexual revolution has rules. And those rules always emerge. They always do. And this, again, is when we get into Peugeot country, because there is an order to the world, and people, even if they're deconstructing certain rules, they're going to make new rules. There are always rules. So this isn't about rule-based Christianity. That's easy to say in 2013. It's tougher to say in 2021. Now, some of you might say, well, why is it always about sex? And that's a very good question. Again, as I said, I listened to the entirety of Christine Hayes' Yale course on the Hebrew Bible. And right off the bat, she notes one of the Jewish distinctions. So there's two main Jewish distinctions. One is she's sort of following Ezekiel Kaufman and the religion of Israel and the distinction between paganism and the meta-divine realm. Now, Christine Hayes is a modernist, Yale University lecture, very much given within a secular frame. I talked to Jacob a little bit, and he said she probably falls sort of into the modernist, progressive. I'm not always sure which nomenclature goes in the Jewish community, but we would say the liberal Jewish community. But the two biggies are contra the meta-divine realm, which is pretty much assumed in all of the rest of paganism, and a peculiarly conservative, and I use that word guardedly, approach to sexuality. Now, we consider it conservative. In the Roman Empire, it would be radical. Now, again, I just finished reading Tom Holland's Dynasty. And so when Claudius takes the throne, Tom Holland, not the throne. No, I'm not really sitting on a throne. Everyone thought that Claudius had very peculiar sexual tastes because he only slept with women. And we hear that and we think. So he wasn't exactly trustworthy because of his sex life. Now, again, Claudius had certain physical disabilities, which is part of the reason he survived the constant dynastic purges, because nobody ever imagined Claudius would ever be emperor of Rome, even though, again, they didn't call it that. But Claudius only slept with women. Nero, of course, quite famously, after he caused the accidental death of his beloved wife, kept trying to replace her, had a slave castrated and turned into a eunuch, and then tried desperately to find someone in the Roman Empire who could, I guess, the first trans wife of an emperor? See, are eunuchs really trans? This is where these things get very complex. So he really wanted to turn his eunuch wife into something that biologically could produce an heir. And there was no such technology in ancient Rome. So that, and if you listen to The Rest is History, Top 10 Eunuchs, you'll hear his story. What pronoun do we use for eunuchs? What pronoun do we use for eunuchs whose emperor husband had him castrated because he accidentally killed his favorite wife? The Jews were very different, very peculiar. And in fact, in Tom Holland's conversation with N.T. Wright on Unbelievable, the Apostle Paul's assertion of what Christian sexuality should be was absolutely radical. Paul was the radical. Conservative Roman emperor sexuality, well, we'll talk about that in a minute. And I was thinking about this morning as I was preparing the slides. There's some connection, perhaps, between the idea of the meta-divine realm and Christian paganism, because in some ways, the meta-divine realm is a feminine space. It's a receptive space. It's a space, it's a tohu wavohu, chaos and order. It's the same femininity of the sea. And the Hebrew God is masculine. He comes in and he pronounces light and darkness. And to talk like one of my favorite Roman Catholics, Mary Cohen, it's that masculine energy. Look at a fist. When we do like this, aren't we raising a phallus in public? One of former pastor of this church, dear friend of mine, loved him greatly, tremendous evangelism, great singer. He and his wife were a great, as many pastors and pastors' wives were. She was a terrific pianist. He was a great singer. But he would often lead worship and do this. And there were some people that just couldn't help but laugh because this, well, we all know what this means. This is masculine energy, and the meta-divine realm is feminine, and God comes in and let there be light, and he separates, and he defines, and he brings order to chaos. Driscoll was bringing order to chaos, right? Masculine. And so the Hebrew God is very masculine. And the realm into which the Hebrew God steps and brings order out of the tohu wavohu is feminine. All right? Again, you guys have been watching Jonathan Pageau. This should all be just review. Now we're really going to have some fun. This is feminist masculinity. Masculinity, feminists believe, at least some feminists believe, is only safe when a woman does it. Two of my favorite progressive Christians to follow on Twitter, Joe Lerman and Mike the Therapist. Mike lives in Sacramento and has written some books. Used to be a pastor in a more conservative denomination, left it to become a therapist, and he tweets pretty reliably progressive, sex-positive stuff on Twitter. Joe Lerman, people who have an issue with trans women using women-only spaces should just be honest and admit they are afraid of cis men. And the thing is, yes, same. All women are afraid of cis men. That's why trans women need to have the safety of women-only spaces. Mike the Therapist says, note what Joe says. All women are afraid of cis men. It's true. Men, allow space for this truth. Some of you might wonder how I keep remembering and finding these things. When I find things that I think are interesting or might be memorable, I log them on my blog. And so my blog is, again, not a list of things I believe in or agree with. My blog is a list of things that I find interesting. And I found this a few years ago, July 6, 2017. I'm done pretending men are safe, even my sons. I have 2 sons. They are strong and compassionate, the kind of boys other parents are glad to meet when their daughters bring them home for dinner. They are good boys in the ways good boys are, but they are not safe boys. I'm starting to believe there's no such thing. I wrote an essay in the Washington Post last year during the height of the Brock Turner case about my sons and rape culture. I don't think it would be controversial when I wrote it. I was sure most parents grappling with raising sons in the midst of rape culture. The struggle I wrote about was universal. I thought, but I was wrong. My essay went semi-viral, and for the very first time, my sons encountered my words about them on their friends' phones, their teachers' computers, and even overheard them discussed by strangers on a crowded metro bus. It was one thing to agree to be written about in relative obscurity, and quite another to have my words intrude on their daily lives. One of my sons was hurt by my words, although he never told me so. He doesn't understand why I lumped him and his brother together in my essay. He sees himself as the good one, the one who is sensitive and thoughtful, the one who listens instead of reacts. He doesn't understand that even quiet misogyny is misogyny, and that not all sexists sound like Twitter trolls. He is angry at me now, although he won't admit that either, and his anger led him to conservative websites and YouTube channels. Probably found Jordan Peterson. Places where he can surround himself with righteous indignation against feminists and tell him it's ungrateful women like me who are the problem. Basically, she goes to this and says, my sons aren't safe. I love my sons. I love some individual men. It pains me to say that I don't feel emotionally safe with them and perhaps never have with a man. It needs to be said because far too often we are afraid to say it. For some, masculinity is only safe when a woman does it because people aren't giving up on masculinity even if they wish men were abolished. And remember what I said about this? So this is a really interesting Christianity Today article written by Tish Harrison Warren, who is a very interesting writer. Did I get her name right? I'll read some of it. But let's just jump to it. The church made vagina sculptures long before Nadia Bolz-Weber, but early Christian Ionic art symbolizes baptism, not free sex. February 26, 2019. In case you haven't heard, Nadia Bolz-Weber recently commissioned a statue of a vagina. She gifted the statue to Gloria Steinem, who I hope will put it on her mantle. Though in a pinch, it could double as a paperweight or a spoon rest. The sculpture exists as part to promote Bolz-Weber's new book, Shameless, and in part as a kind of performance art protest against the damage done by purity culture. She invited women to mail in their purity rings in exchange for a certificate of impurity and then melted them down to form the statue. Bolz-Weber has been applauded by some as an artistic celebration of female sexual liberation. Her critics, by contrast, bring up the authority of the Bible, the Christian call to repentance, and the need to distinguish destructive parts of purity culture from basic Christian sexual ethics like chastity and marital fidelity. Others take issue with the icon itself as a fertility idol, or at least a sex idol, since I'm assuming the statue is on the pill. Tish Warren is a great writer. A few less helpful critics respond essentially, ooh, vagina art, icky. However, long before Bolz-Weber's book tour and the ensuing debate, Christians have been making Ionic art. Ionic, by the way, means vaginal shaped, or technically vulva shaped, as a feminine counterpart to the phallus. And then she goes into that. And what I noticed, yay! So masculine doesn't go away. This doesn't go away. It's only safe with a female arm. Now, again, Bolz-Weber, weightlifting, tats, sleeveless shirts. You know, you always see in her some attempt to 6'1", that's sort of masculine, strength that's sort of masculine, assaultive, profane, the pastor that maybe she's a longshoreman, masculine, but she's a woman. Men aren't safe. Cis men aren't safe. Yay. Little quote from Tom Holland's Dynasty, and the whole section is quite interesting. In a city where the phallus was everywhere to be seen, protecting doorways as a symbol of good luck, guarding roadsides and scaring off birds in gardens, ramrod size was much admired. And why was Claudius seen as being a little sexually odd? Because he only slept with women. Now, when I say slept with women, doesn't mean wife or wives. I mean slave girls and consorts and concubines, etc., etc., etc. But because for a Roman man meant always to penetrate and never be penetrated. It's interesting that Steinem is like this and Bolz-Weber's like this. Who has given, who has received? Can you imagine a celebrity pastor giving Larry Flynt a golden phallus made up of melted down wedding bands by liberated men, by men liberated from enforced monogamy? Now, when I watched Roush V talk to, glad I saw it when I had the chance. When Roush V talked to Milo, I just tried to pull that up. This video is no longer available because the YouTube account associated with this video has been terminated. Whose YouTube account was terminated? Was Milo's account terminated? Yep, Milo's account was terminated. Isn't that interesting? Prohibiting hate speech. Again, the point of all of this is to, what has the church been doing? The church is trying to figure out masculine and feminine. And it's doing it in real life. And it's doing it the way people figure things out as communities, with opposing ideas and opposing frames. And this is, in many ways, what's going on under the surface. Now, Nadia Bolz-Weber is promoted to the center of a hierarchy. Mark Driscoll is exiled in a marketplace, but can't be dismissed because the hierarchy is implicit. And so this is what was so interesting about her promotion to this post. Because for the ELCA, in a sense, what they are saying is for her to be the first pastor of public witness, she now embodies in many ways what the ELCA wants to be and become. She is their head. She is their leader. What kind of head? What kind of leader? And now Driscoll is tyrannical. I don't get the sense from anything I've read that she's tyrannical at all. And so, again, that's part of the reason people say, Driscoll, he's evil because he's tyrannical, and she's not evil because she's not tyrannical. That's a very fair point. But now, remember, we're talking about the emergent movement. And the emergent movement pushes back on the boomers and their button-down corporate, scientific, modernistic approach that sort of wants to mass produce certain kinds of Christians. And so both Driscoll and Bolz-Weber are in some ways fringe actors saying there needs to be space for us at the fringe. Now, Driscoll was brought into the center of evangelicalism and then pushed out. Bolz-Weber is now brought into the center of this mainline denomination. My guess is she won't be pushed out, because when I think about what she would have to do to be pushed out, I've got a pretty good imagination. I'm sort of hard pressed to think about what that would be. Now, both are responding to disappointments by embracing a certain brand of conservatism. Now, for Driscoll, the conservatism is obvious. Bolz-Weber, she wouldn't be anywhere near as interesting if she didn't use Christian iconography, if she didn't show up in a sleeveless shirt with a clerical collar, if she wasn't festooned in sort of steampunk goth Christian stuff. Okay? There's a conservatism in there too. But just like I said, the Apostle Paul in his approach to human sexuality was radical against the conservatism of the Roman Empire, in which the Emperor Claudius is weird. There are different layers of conservatism under Nadia Bolz-Weber, and in some ways, this is how we're tracking. Every church is always in danger of paganism. Different churches are in danger of different kinds of paganism. The main line is in danger of a particular type of paganism that Bolz-Weber is in some ways exemplifying. It's a paganism that you can have Jesus alongside of your other ascendant saints and holy people. That's a certain brand of paganism. Now, there's a difference in assumed and asserted moral norms in their two warring tribes, and that accounts for a lot of the differences between them. But again, there's a like-opposite thing going on here. And there are polarity dynamics at work because I would say both are fundamentally reactive. And again, summoning up Jonathan Pageau's parasitic processing video, both are reactive. But in a way, Driscoll is reactive to the reactives and the revolutionaries, which sort of makes him conservative, but is it really conservative? And it's this way that Pageau is interesting, because Jonathan goes back and basically embraces the hierarchy and the monarchy. Driscoll stays in Protestant land, and part of the reason he remains, I think, fundamentally defective is he remains, ironically, even after he's been deep in the heart of Young, Restless, and Reformed, his own Savior and Lord, which Tim Keller or John Piper could say, well, that's sort of Reformed Christianity 101. There's one Savior and Lord, and you ain't it. Now, in a secular age, celebrity is the last public transcendence. I picked that up in Mike Cosper's latest episode, I Kiss Christianity Goodbye, on Josh Harris. Fascinating. And Cosper has been doing a lot of reading and analysis, as many Young, Restless, and Reformed. Hansen, too, who Gospel Coalition, Colin Hansen, termed that, gave us that meme, Young, Restless, and Reformed. You'll find Hansen quite often reading or commenting on Charles Taylor. Now, I had Andrew Root on the channel. Now, he's, again, part of mainline Lutheranism. He's been reading Charles Taylor. Charles Taylor has been pervasive enough that in many ways